everyone. So, I don't know, I guess just a quick update. We're nearing the final stretch. Obviously, we only have sort of a couple of topics left. I want to finish talking about spatial cognition in particular. And then there will be one other big topic that hopefully I'll start with by the end of this lecture and continue on until Thursday, which is on numerical cognition. There are some obvious jumping off points when it comes to numbers, our understanding of number in relation to space, also in relation to working memory that we talked about before. So there are going to be some obvious connections with these topics going forward, and so I think it's a nice way to kind of wrap things up this semester. Okay, so remember the last time we were talking about navigation, and in particular we were talking about what happens when you get disoriented in the world and you have to figure out where your heading is, right? Where your initial orientation was, so that you can search for some target object, something that's been hidden in the environment. So this is a case where young kids were being disoriented in a rectangular space and then tested on whether they could find a hidden object. And the two key findings were that when the object or the rectangular space is all a single color, so that there's no landmark information and just the shape of the environment, kids would search at the two geometrically correct corners, right? When there was a landmark, though, they did not search at just the correct corner. They continued to rely on the geometry, which suggests that in this case, you know, they're quite successful. They're using the information that's available to them. In this one, they're failing to the extent that they're not combining the available information, right? There are two kinds of information available now, and they're just relying on the rectangular shape. It's still impressive that a two-year-old, a young two-year-old can use geometric information, but the bigger question becomes, why can't they combine something else that's also allocentric, that in some ways, if you're already doing the geometry, seems relatively trivial to just add on the color information to disambiguate those corners. I don't want to put that up just yet. Okay. There's something called an interference task. Have you guys heard about this before? So suppose you're doing one, suppose I want to know whether, you have spatial language vocabulary. And I want to make sure that spatial language vocabulary isn't based on your motoric abilities, right? How you move around in the world. That might sound weird, but maybe that's what I want to know. So if I want to know that, I would ask you about spatial words while you're having to do something motoric, right? Maybe I'm asking you to stomp your feet or do some kind of tapping. Interference, that's the kind of interference that people will use in these experiments, right? You want to know whether something is due to skill A and not B, so what do? You interfere with skill B. If you interfere with skill B and skill A is still obvious, then it can't be due to skill B, right? So it's a way of creating people talk about it as being a kind of cognitive way to create like a lesion, right? Or to disrupt a particular brain region. Here you're disrupting the cognitive process, okay? So that's what they did in this experiment. They wanted to know, if we take adults now, while they're doing reorientation, and language is what allows them to do the combinatorial thing with respect to the geometry, then if we wipe out their language ability, if we interfere with their language ability, then performance should decline. But if it has nothing to do with language, then if you interfere with language, performance won't decline. Make sense? So what they did is they took adults now, we're going back to adults, who we know solve this task. We know they go to the correct corner on every trial when there's a landmark. And while they're getting disoriented and then searching, there's a loudspeaker in the room playing a story. The story has spatial language in it, and it's language, and the adults are being told to repeat what they hear. So we're interfering with their language while they search for the hidden object, okay? And when you do that, I'll start with that first, is that adults look like children again, in that they start searching at the two geometrically correct corners. So if they're doing reorientation in this experiment, loudspeaker in the room, they're repeating what they're hearing. Now all of a sudden they start searching at the two geometrically correct corners, suggesting that language was in fact the thing that was helping them combine geometry with landmark. Yeah.
I'm so sorry, could you clarify like the two setups?
Yeah.
I got confused with like the sound.
Yeah, totally. So that's what I'm calling here the verbal interference. Verbal interference, language interference, is when you disrupt your language ability while you're doing the task. And the way we disrupt it is by interfering. Other way to refer to this in cognitive science terms is a dual task. So you're doing two things at once. And so now you're repeating the story. And again, we find that they search at the two geometrically correct corners. But maybe it's not that language is required for combining the two kinds of information. Maybe you just made the task harder, because now people have to do two things at once, and so their performance has gone down. So what's critical when you set up an interference experiment like this is you want another interference task that makes the task harder, because you're doing two things at once, but it's not disrupting language, right? So now the second condition is that there's this nonverbal interference condition where they are reoriented again, looking for the object, but they're told to do some kind of rhythmic clapping that they're repeating. If the interference task just makes everything harder, then performance in that condition will look just like the language interference, and it doesn't, right? So now they continue to search at just the correct corner, suggesting it was language that is needed and not anything else. Yeah.
And this, just to clarify, the story in the beginning is a story about finding the object?
It could be anything.
Oh, it's just a random story.
Just random story. You just want, again, the idea is if your language capacity is what gives you flexibility when combining different kinds of information in the world, right? If language is unique in that not only does it allow you to talk about things in certain ways, in all kinds of ways, it gives your brain more flexibility in terms of how you think about things and how you combine things, right? Then what you do is you say, well, what if we interfere with language? What if we disrupt it? Now, we can't give you a stroke, right, and say, now you have aphasia and your language is gone and test you, but we can interfere with your language system by giving you the interference test. And this is done a lot in cognitive psychology and developmental psychology when you want to know whether something is, whether a particular ability is really responsible. You just interfere with it and see what happens to your performance. Now, what's cool about this is that the other thing that you should keep in mind is that in these interference tests, if you are just making the task harder, right, and the reason that this changes performance is because it's just hard to do two things at once. What you'd actually expect is that people would completely fall apart, meaning that they would now search randomly at each corner because they're just like so confused, there's so much going on, they can't use any information. But what's cool about this is it's not that they fall apart and they don't use, and they just start searching randomly. It's they fall apart by not combining the landmark with the geometry. And so now they look like 2-year-olds and rats who don't have language, right? And search at the two geometrically correct corners. So the idea here is that modularity, which exists for geometric processing and navigation, is specific to the non-verbal mind and brain, right? The geometric module is the default in animals that don't have language, and so this is a very reliable source of information to use, and they use it. But once you get language, you can become more flexible in the spatial information that you use out there in the world, is the idea, the general story. Okay, any questions about this? Yeah.
So the geometric is just like the default, and then they do it faster just because they've combined the two?
They do it faster. They do it better. You could say faster, but the key is it's about combining the two, like you said.
Okay.
Make sense? Okay. I did say, though, when we started on spatial cognition that we'd be talking about navigation and where things are located in the world, the where about things in the world. But I also want to talk about other abilities that we use all the time that rely on spatial cognition. Right? We use it for fun, right? We play certain games that are spatial in nature, puzzles, video games. We use it by necessity if we have to put furniture together or pack. I'm always so impressed by this. I'm like, damn, right? That person knows what they were doing. These kinds of tasks are known to task something that we call mental rotation. Okay? This is when you're using your spatial working memory to manipulate objects in a particular way. You're predicting their orientations. You're thinking about their future position if viewed from a different orientation, right? It is a skill that, again, we use for fun and by necessity when it comes to things like packing and putting furniture together. It's a skill that people like to use also as an index of IQ. The idea that this particular skill predicts general intelligence. There can be some disagreement about this because people can be low in sort of spatial ability and very high in verbal, for example, and do very well in their lives and be considered high IQ type people. But this is a kind of task that has become more prevalent when it comes to assessing intelligence and nonverbal abilities. So again, it's the visualization and mental manipulation of images in your mind. Practically, when you look at these kinds of tests, it looks something like this. Maybe some of you have seen these on standardized tests. You'd be shown two objects, and you're asked to say, are these objects the same or different? What's critical is that the objects that are the same but just rotated by some amount. The objects that are different are mirror images, so that you can't rotate one into the other, right? They're like your hands. These are not so difficult, but a little, I don't know, they're moderate, same, different, right? So what's interesting about this and why it's mental rotation is that the way people figure this out is they try to rotate one object into the other in their minds, right? And adults will tell you that that's often what they do. It's not the only strategy. There are things that people will do in terms of comparing blocks, the number of blocks, their positioning. But in general, a common strategy is to say, I'm trying to rotate it in my mind. Young kids who are given child-friendly versions of this task, who may not be able to articulate that, will look at the pieces and then you'll see them gesture and be like, right, as if they're trying to do it in their minds. So, and the real sort of strong evidence that this is actually being done by way of mental rotation is there is what is known as this angular disparity effect. So what I'm showing you here is the reaction time, how long it takes you to judge whether these are the same or different, and the amount of disparity of orientation between the two objects. So what this says is that the bigger the difference between the orientations of the objects, right? So suppose you're comparing two objects where one is in this orientation and the other one's like this, versus one that's like this. The one that's farther in orientation takes longer to respond to. What this says is that we're doing mental rotation, but it also tells us something about how we compute things in our minds. It tells us that this is being done in what we call an analog way, right? We are treating these objects in our minds as if they were objects in the real world, right? So it's a very cool thing that our minds and brains, the way they're set up with neurons firing and so on, right? Computing on and off sort of firing patterns, is depicting the real world spatial relations and motions of objects in the world. Our minds are doing it in the same way, right? So this is a very big discovery in terms of how our minds process information, but it's also nice to just talk about mental rotation specifically and how we solve these problems. Okay. So mental rotation is interesting for a lot of reasons. Like I said, it tells us about how we compute things in our minds, but it also tells us about what kinds of things we might be interested in and what things we might be successful at. So there are a couple of studies now. One I really, really love that looked at kids who were 12 and 13 years of age. They gave them this task. This task is known as the Shepard and Metzler task, named after the two authors that first did this study and discovered these effects. So performance on this task at 12 and 13 years of age predicts two things. It predicts what your college major is. So the higher you score on this task at 12 and 13 years, the more likely you are to end up in a STEM major, science, engineering, math, and the more likely you are to have a career later on that is STEM related, right? Some people will say, why do we care about this? Who cares? Not everybody has to go into STEM. And that's true. Not everybody has to go into STEM. But, you know, in a lot of countries, it's a way to wealth, right? It's a way to increase social status, given the connotations. So there are important reasons to think about how well you do on this to promote STEM success later on in life. What's cool about this is they actually did look at whether just general intelligence and related to other domains predicts whether you end up in STEM. No, it's really mental rotation. In fact, the mental rotation was a better predictor than a math test itself, for example, right? So there's something about this test and how you do this and how well you are that leads to this trajectory of ending up in fields that presumably rely on this ability more, that represent more general interests related to this ability and so on. Yeah.
Do you think other tasks that require mental rotation, like Tetris, have similar outcomes, or it's this task specifically that can act as a predictor?
Yeah, interest in so one other thing that's relevant here that we'll talk about it in a little bit is that spatial ability and how you do on a mental rotation task is not fixed, right? It's not that you're gonna be good at it or not, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? You actually can do something about it. It's practice, and doing things that are relevant for this, right? So one thing that people have done is they've taken games like a Tetris, and said, okay, if we give people more exposure and they get better at Tetris, does it improve mental rotation overall? It does. So presumably, right, if you were to follow that through, you know, more Tetris exposure, whatever, an ability to do Tetris would presumably predict STEM outcomes also. The challenge is that video games bring with them a whole host of other interests that may be relevant for deciding what career trajectory you have, right? So one thing that I find super interesting is there's actually one kind of video game that is the best for promoting mental rotation ability. It's not Tetris. Any ideas what it is? Go for it.
It was like an action 3D first-person shooting game.
It's first-person shooter. Amazing for mental rotation. Okay? So this is challenging, right? Because parents come into the lab and they're also like, what should I do for my kid to help them like get better at mental rotation? And you don't want to be like, well, have them play first-person shooter because that's the best, because there are other problems with these games, right? But it actually is the best one. People think it may be because it creates a really sort of 3D virtual environment that has you moving around in ways that really requires prediction from different orientations and so on. So it really does promote mental rotation ability. I've done a little bit of work looking at training interventions for mental rotation to see how it improves kids' abilities in relation to this. And what we'll talk about in a little bit is that there's a big gender difference on this task, on these mental rotation tasks. And I had wanted to do these experiments where it was going to be video game training with kids and following them up later to see how much they improved and what their trajectory was and so on. And in particular, the idea was to improve the mental rotation abilities of kids who were on average lower performing, and they tend to be girls, which we'll talk about in a bit. There's a gender difference here. And the idea was to use video games, right? But the problem is, you want to do this experiment where you start off with two groups of kids who have had no exposure to video games, right? Boys and girls. Give them the exposure, and then see how they improve. So the problem is, I challenge you to find a boy that has not had video game exposure, right? They don't exist for the most part, right? So we never did it because we couldn't figure out a way, especially if you want to start with college-age students. No way, right? This male species does not exist, or in far less quantities, right? So we never did it, but we'll talk more about experience in a bit. Okay, actually, I didn't want to put this up right away, the fruit. Okay, so again, if you want to really sort of think about mental rotation and the relation to STEM and you see these associations, then ideally you'd also be able to assess it starting earlier in development. And that is something that people have been doing. They've developed mental rotation tasks for kids. So here's an example of a mental rotation task that you can do with kids who are 3 years of age and older. So you tell them that there are these two pieces that if you put together in your mind, they make one of these, right? And so the idea is you would think about these two sort of coming together and you would identify, which one am I identifying? That one, right? Yeah. So that's what you have to do. The problem with these, and they're not ideal because you can also use certain features try to identify which ones are correct, right? Do you see pointy things here versus here and so on? But for the most part, a task like this can be used with preschoolers in the way that the Shepherd and Metzler cubes can't, because they're just too hard for 3-year-olds. We've even developed versions of this for babies where it's a change detection task. Objects are moving around in different orientations, and for one of them, the mirror one, it also flips into its mirror image every once in a while. And the idea is if you can track these different orientations, the one that switches into the mirror image will seem more different, and you'll be able to, and you look longer at that one. What's important about this is that even with a young baby, if you can test them on a mental rotation task, it predicts their performance at 4 years of age on math. So a baby who looks longer at the mirror image in this change detection paradigm scores higher on a standardized math test. So from the earliest moments that we can test mental rotation, it's already relevant to what a kid is going, how a kid is going to perform on a math test, right? Again, the idea here is that there's something about the connection between mental rotation, spatial abilities, and math, right? When you're solving a math problem, you're having to manipulate the numbers in your mind, right, to think about the addition or the subtraction or whatnot. And it seems to recruit the parts of the mind and brain that are involved in mental rotation and spatial reasoning, and why do we think it predicts better performance on a math test later on in life at preschool age, right? Yeah.
Do you think that's a correlational thing or a causality thing?
Yeah. So this is correlational data. It's at least longitudinal, right? Meaning that it gives you a bit more causality because you're saying, okay, spatial ability early in life, what about later in life for math? But ideally, you would do training interventions. So you could causally say, I'm going to train you on a spatial task, mental rotation. And then after some training, when you get better at the spatial task, I'm going to see whether you do better on a math test. There are some studies showing that that's also the case, that it's causal. That the better you get at mental rotation, the better you get at solving math problems. Again, it may be something about mentally manipulating information that you often do on math tests that are necessary. I'm not telling you this here. I wasn't going to tell you, but I will now. There are a lot of prominent scientists that you will have heard of, Einstein, Tesla, Kekule. In their memoirs, they often talk about how when they had some insight, when they made some discovery, right, it was about mental manipulation, right? They were thinking about something. Sometimes it's even in their dreams, right? Kekule, who discovered the molecule, the arrangement for benzene, said that he dreamt of a snake eating its tail, right? So again, there are these connections when it comes to having the mental capacity to manipulate things spatially that promotes these kinds of insights or creativity. I didn't tell you this, but better mental rotation at 13 predicts STEM, right? Better mental rotation in adults predicts the number of patents people have, right? So it is, again, related to creativity and scientific discovery. But like I said, there are gender differences when it comes to this and when it also comes to navigation. So let's talk about some of those and why they exist. When it comes to navigation in adults, the gender difference isn't that one gender is better than the other at navigating. That's not the difference. The difference is that one gender tends to rely on certain kinds of information to navigate, and the other, other kinds of information, right? So imagine you're out there giving directions. Again, no one does this anymore, right? Because you just use your GPS. But once upon a time, people would get lost. They'd stop on the street and ask someone where to go, right? And then someone has to give them the direction. So these experiments have been done in the lab where they force people to give directions to one another to see how they talk about navigation and getting from point A to point B. And the big difference that you find when giving directions or planning routes, if you're trying to get from point A to point B, is that men tend to use cardinal direction more than women. So men will use cardinal direction language more, north, south, east, and west. Landmarks are used more by women than men, especially if they're beacons that can be used. Now, you can navigate just fine in our culture using one strategy or the other, right? I can tell you to drive north half a mile and then go east after that point, and you could track it. Or I could say, you know, to go straight down the street here until you get to the stop sign, and then when you see the quick trip down the road, take a left, right? You can navigate just fine using either strategy, but there does seem to be this reliable gender difference in terms of which kind of information people like. Okay. Why would that be? Any thoughts? Any kinds of experiences that you think would matter? What about just navigating in the world? Just going places? Could that be a difference? Could there be a gender difference in terms of where people travel and how far they go? Yeah.
Maybe like people use the man to drive farther distances. So like men have, like there is like a stereotype that like men are better drivers, so maybe they just drive their family more.
That's interesting, right? So maybe they're doing more of that and taking the lead in terms of navigation. Yeah. Any other thoughts? So this has changed a little bit over the years, but as recent as about 10 years ago, 2013, there was still work showing that men travel more farther than women. Which is weird, right? Because a lot of this is kind of business travel related, right? So you think if people are in similar jobs, why are men traveling more than women, right? So it turns out that that's not where the real difference is. So if you look at college students like you guys, and you go around and you survey men and women about where they've been on campus, where they go, there's a difference, right? Women will on average say, well, you know, I went to that building and that building for class, and then this other one for lunch and so on, right? If you poll male students, on average, they will say that they went to other random places on campus. And you'll ask them why, and there's no good reason, right? Male students are just wandering more, apparently. Hey, those are the data, right? Don't look at me like I made this up. But there's a difference, and that might be a difference. It's not a difference in spatial ability necessarily, right? It could be some difference in general interest about exploration and whatnot. But the consequence, we think, is that because of that general interest in exploration or activity, that it could have a consequence then on what kinds of spatial information you use and find more reliable to navigate, right? So it's not that the difference exists necessarily from the get-go. It could be certain experiences by way of other kinds of interests that may promote one strategy versus another. That's one way to interpret these results, right? Okay, but what if you look at younger kids? I should mention one other great example, I forgot about this, that shows how you navigate in the world makes a big difference in terms of what kind of information you use or how much navigation. So this is the black cab in London. For those of you who have been to London, you recognize them, I'm sure. It is still a very serious occupation in that in London, to be a taxi driver, you have to go through this very extensive training. The course is actually called On the Knowledge, which is such a cool name. So every London taxi driver has to pass the On the Knowledge course. And like I said, it's very extensive because London, it's not a grid system, right? When I say grid, you guys know what I mean? Like in New York, 1st, 2nd, 3rd Street, and it's like all aligned. London's more like Atlanta, right? Not a grid. It's harder to navigate when it's not a grid, right? You really have to know all the different routes and form these cognitive maps. So these people are amazing. They're probably better than the GPS, right, at getting around and navigating, given this course. What they have found is that these London taxi drivers have hippocampus, right? The hippocampus we've talked about as being involved in memory. It's also very important for spatial navigation, where you need memory for routes and so on. Their hippocampi, I guess, plural, is distributed somewhat differently than those. The anterior posterior distribution of the hippocampus looks different in these folks compared to people who have not been on the knowledge, right? So this training not only changes how you navigate and your cognitive capacity for this, but it changes your brain in terms of the hippocampus in particular. And this is very causal stuff, right, when it comes to the design of this experiment. Okay, so experience matters. What about non-experiential effects? Could there be genetic bases, biological bases for some of these differences? So to figure that out, you want to test younger kids, where boys and girls have not had big differences in experience. Here's one version of a test that did this. So this is the reorientation paradigm again. Remember, this is the rectangular looking box. It's surrounded by a circular enclosure. Typically, the box would have 4 white containers. You would hide it in one position, disorient the kid, and then you see where they go, right? And in those cases, they would go to the 2 geometrically correct corners. In this case, what was done is that the target location was marked by what we call a beacon, right? This is like the flag marking the spot, or the platform in the Morris Water Maze. The object is right there. So in this experiment, kids actually don't make mistakes here, right? In this experiment, it's not like the blue wall. The beacon actually is used by the kids pretty consistently. They go there. So you test kids a couple of times on this first phase. They tend to go here. That's the correct corner of the beacon. And then while they're being disoriented, after some number of trials, while the kids' eyes are covered, you replace the containers with containers that look just like the beacon. So now you open your eyes. And you can't solve the task by just looking for the beacon anymore, right? You have to use the geometry. So the question is, when kids are using the beacon here, are they also simultaneously representing the geometry in case it's needed, right? Some distance in the future. And in the second phase, if you've been representing the geometry, then you'll go to the 2 correct ones. If you were just paying attention to the beacon, you're going to be at chance here, right? So what happens? 18-month-old babies, toddlers, young kids, as I said, will go to the beacon when it's correct. In the first phase, this is girls and boys. In the second phase, the boys go to the 2 geometric corners, the girls don't. So it suggests that by 18 months, there's already a kind of strategy difference, in that boys are finding the geometry salient enough to represent it along with the beacon. The girls are not doing that at 18 months. So it doesn't seem like this is an experience thing in terms of navigation. 18-month-olds are not on their own, like exploring. That doesn't happen, usually. So people have asked, could there be a more biological basis for these differences that promote a male brain to prefer some kinds of information and a female brain to prefer other kinds of information? So what's one way in which male and female brains are different? One way is in relation to the hormone testosterone. Okay? So testosterone is very important prenatally for the development of sex organs. It also has a role in brain development. That's prenatally. So there are big differences in terms of male and female fetuses with respect to their hormone levels as they're developing prenatally. Those hormone levels remain different between boys and girls until about their 6 months of age. After that, boys and girls are equal. There's no difference in circulating hormones. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because the difference in the 18-month-olds cannot be due to circulating hormones at that time during the experiment. It would have to be a prenatal developmental thing, okay? And then what happens is that the hormones differ again at puberty. So there are prenatal differences in testosterone levels. They even out. Boys and girls are exactly the same in terms of testosterone until puberty again. So what we want to know here is there a way that the prenatal exposure to testosterone shapes your brain so that males prefer certain kinds of information and females prefer different kinds of information? Like I said, the 18-month-olds have the same amount of testosterone, so we can't figure it out in an 18-month-old, right? We can't take their blood and see if there are individual differences. We have to do it prenatally, but we can't go back in time, and it's actually hard to do the testosterone stuff prenatally. So you can use animal models. So here's what you can do. Here's your friendly rat on the radial arm maze. Remember that the radial arm maze is where we bait one of the arms with a treat so that the rat searches for it. And the rat can find the treat either because of landmarks in the surrounding room or the shape of the surrounding room, right? So now we can make like a rectangular type shape of a room. We can put landmarks on it, and we can see what kinds of information the rat uses to search for the baited arm. Okay, but I also said we want to manipulate testosterone, right? So how do we do it? So the way it's been done is you can test 4 groups of rats. So let me start with the normal rats. These would be the control males and the control females. It means you don't do anything to them. Okay, just leave the male and the female rats alone and test them. Then the other 2 groups are, you can castrate the male rats. Once you castrate them, shortly after birth, they're done, no more testosterone, all right? They're effectively like akin to a female rat. Or you can give the female rats estradiol, which acts similarly to testosterone, right? So you can take these 2 groups and manipulate them biologically with respect to testosterone. If testosterone, let's start with, if testosterone matters for the kind of information you use in the environment, and it's related in particular to things like geometry or cardinal direction, what would you predict? Any thoughts? Any thoughts if the male rats and the control males and the control females look like the babies or the 18-month-olds I just told you about? How would they perform? What kinds of information would the control male rats use, do you think? They can use geometry or landmarks. What are they going to use? They would use geometry. Female rats would use landmarks. That's what they find. Okay? And that's kind of replicating what we see in human adults and kids, where there's a difference in preference for the kind of information. But here's where the really cool causal stuff comes in when it comes to testosterone. Now, the castrated male rat performs like the control female rat. The castrated male uses landmarks more than geometry, and the female rat treated with the estradiol uses the geometry more than the landmarks, okay? So 2 and 3, the control males and the treated females use geometry, and 1 and 4 use the landmarks. So here's the evidence. It doesn't mean that experience isn't having an impact also. We know experience has an impact, right? We've seen how experience with respect to spatial language can have an impact. The idea that different types of navigation and how far you travel can have an impact. But this also suggests that there is some biological basis for why males and females may rely on different kinds of information, right? That could potentially be exacerbated by different experiences also. Now, of course, these are rats and not humans, but we are using rats here as an animal model to say that in principle it could be true in humans also, yeah.
So in general, is using geometric information, does that make you better at navigation?
I mean, like I said, you can use both effectively,
Right.
right? And in the case of the orientation room with the rectangle, it would make you worse because you can't distinguish between the two corners, right? The idea though is that at least for long-term travel, long-distance travel, that because geometry is more reliable, it would be a more effective strategy. If you're thinking about humans' evolutionary history, where there were gender differences in terms of who's doing the hunting, who's doing the right? It could mean that that would have privileged a testosterone brain to use that kind of information more if you have to navigate farther to hunt animals and that sort of thing. That's an evolutionary argument, maybe, right? But again, you can't deny this work showing the link between testosterone and the kind of information that you rely on. Okay. Mental rotation. What about mental rotation? Like I said, there are sex differences here as well. On average, men and boys are faster and more accurate than women on these kinds of tasks. The other thing, though, that people don't talk of, than women and girls, the other thing that people don't talk about in terms of a difference that I actually think is equally interesting is not just that there's an average, that there's average higher performance, there's also more variability among males, right? So if you're looking at distributions, right, where you have sort of the number of people at different levels of performance, right? On average, this is in blue, the idea that males would perform somewhat higher than females. But what you also should look at when you look at these kinds of data, in terms of how many people are performing at these levels, is the spread of the distribution. So in addition to being higher performers, there's higher variability among males than females. This, I think, is a really interesting finding because on average, across other tasks as well, males are the more variable gender. They're just more variable on a lot of tasks, right? But in this task, it's equally interesting that there's an average. I used to always joke about how, oh, whatever, maybe, you know, maybe men have a slight advantage on mental rotation, but I wouldn't want to be a man because there's an equal probability that you're going to be at the high end and at the low end, right? So more geniuses, but more idiots too, right? That's how I used to joke about it, right? I mean, it's true. Technically, right, there's slightly more at either end. But in any case, those are the two things. On average, better performance, but on average, more variability too. And I actually do find this somewhat distressing, for real, when you see boys doing these tasks, and again, on average, some are really, really great, but there are some that are really bad also, worse than the girls. So I've always thought, you know, this is the kind of thing where if you know these differences exist, you want to improve performance for everyone, right? It's not just you're targeting girls, you're targeting anyone who is having difficulty on these kinds of tasks. If, again, it's good at predicting things like STEM and has other nice consequences. Okay, so what might some of the explanations be for why there is this difference in gender? Oh, and I should say that this difference is the kind of thing you see in adults, but I've also said it's present in kids. This is actually a study that came out of my lab where we did a meta-analysis. For those of you who don't know what a meta-analysis is, it just means you do an analysis on all the available data out there to determine the reliability and the strength of a particular effect. You get thousands and thousands of data points rather than just a smaller sample in any given study. And we basically looked at data on mental rotation tasks, different kinds of mental rotation tasks for kids from preschoolers all the way up to adolescents, and looked at the strength of the effect. This is in the end what these kinds of data look like. So this is on the y-axis, the effect size. That means the strength of the difference between the performance of boys and girls. Anything that's positive on this plot means that boys are doing better than girls. Those are the data. And when it's lower than 0, it means that girls are doing better. So this is across all of the studies out there in the world when it comes to mental rotation in kids. These circles just mean how much data is being contributed to the effects. But what you see is that the effect becomes reliable. There's a reliable male advantage at 6 years of age, not earlier, and it steadily increases. So if the advantage is there at 6 years of age and not earlier, and you get this increase starting at 6, any thoughts in terms of the mechanism or what might account for the difference between boys and girls? What might be causing this male advantage to emerge at around 6 and to steadily increase? Any thoughts? Yep.
Could be the tasks that those boys are doing,
Yeah, like what?
like playing Call of Duty.
Yeah. Well, doesn't have to be that one specifically.
Yeah.
Yes.
but-
Could be video game exposure. By this age, remember I said you can't find a college male that hasn't played video games? I know I'm exaggerating, but at 6 years of age is already a huge difference. Boys are playing with video games like 3-4 times more than girls. So that exposure could be causing it to emerge. Any other thoughts? Did you have a thought?
Yeah, I was looking about like school starting to like maybe influences from like teachers and whatnot, maybe have to do with some encouragement or
People have talked about that, right? If there's a kind of stereotype about boys, even if it's not that they're better at this, that maybe they like it better, right? And so you encourage certain activities of boys compared to girls that end up promoting spatial reasoning. People have talked about that. They've also talked about how parents use more spatial language with boys than girls. This has been documented, which again may promote spatial reasoning in a way that is good for mental rotation. So these examples are out there in the literature, and there are data to back up these experiential environmental explanations, which involve different activities like video games, block building, puzzles, where boys may be playing more with those activities than girls, has been shown to relate to mental rotation performance. Like I said, spatial language from parents and teachers perhaps also affects mental rotation performance. There's another thing that happens at around 6, and kids start to become aware of things at around 6. And the thing that I'm talking about is stereotypes, right? The stereotype that maybe boys enjoy or like certain activities better than others. Maybe they're better spatially, right? Maybe they'll become better drivers and this sort of thing, right? These stereotypes are out there, and 6-year-olds start to become aware of these stereotypes. Why are stereotypes relevant here? Because stereotypes have been shown to cause anxiety, right? If you know the stereotype and you're about to do something where you may feel like you don't live up to performance because there's a stereotype that as a girl I'm going to do worse, right? Causes anxiety. Remember what we said anxiety does? Causes you to ruminate, causes you to use up your working memory capacities. Mental rotation is relying on spatial working memory to hold the image in mind, to manipulate it right, so you can potentially suffer as a consequence of the anxiety related to the stereotype. So we actually know that these effects exist in terms of stereotypes and performance because there are some classic studies that were originally done with adults and then they've been done with school-age kids. You bring people into the lab. Everybody's going to get a mental rotation task, for example, to do. Just before they do the task, you tell one group of adults, for example, hey, you're going to do this thing, it's called mental rotation. You may have heard it's kind of hard, but do your best, go for it. That's what one group hears. The other group hears, again, hey, you're going to do this mental rotation test. You may have heard it's hard. It is, especially for women. They do worse than men. off you go, right? Women who hear that do much worse in that condition than the ones who don't, right? So it shows that at least making the stereotype explicit in this case can reduce performance for women across the two conditions. It actually is interesting because when you say that, when you induce the stereotype in that condition for women and they do worse, it also seems to have this weird effect on men in that they do a little bit better, right? They get this boost, right? Maybe not surprising, but you get these big differences across condition. In kids, we don't really do that. Parents don't like us to say things like that to their kids before they're about to do an experiment. But we've done something even more subtle that works well. So you bring the kid into the lab and they're going to do the mental rotation test. And some of the kids will do a color, they'll be giving a coloring book. And some of the kids will color like a castle. And some other kids will color, for example, a girl playing with dolls. Just implicitly getting the girls to color the girl thing and inducing like girly-like exposure, they perform worse. So it shows that these stereotypes have potentially a big impact on performance on these things. Yeah.
Has anyone ever like tried to test them like the opposite way? Like telling the participants that like men perform worse in that specific task?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like the
They
general
have.
public is not like familiar with like how people
Yeah,
perform.
it doesn't work, and the idea is it's because it's not a pervasive stereotype, right? The stereotype may be more general, right? The stereotype may be more, it's not just space, it's math, it's STEM kinds of things, right? Where there are at least differences in the members of those disciplines, right? There are more men in STEM than women, particularly in things like engineering, right, and physics. Those differences exist in the world, right? Now, those differences can exist for a lot of reasons, right? It could be different interests, nothing to do with ability, right? But when you see those differences in the world, one interpretation is it is ability, right? And that's potentially how those stereotypes then become about ability, as opposed to the fact that, you know, maybe women needed more time, they were generally the stay-at-home caregiver, right, and didn't have the time to dedicate to those resources. So those things may happen historically, and then the stereotype comes out of that, unfortunately. But I think it's probably a more pervasive stereotype that men, on average, are better at things that are STEM-like. And so when you say it about space mental rotation, people, yeah, they just accept it. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so again, just to summarize about spatial anxiety, the idea is that women and girls will experience more because of this stereotype. It's often called stereotype threat. It doesn't just exist for gender, they've shown it for race also when it comes to performance on different tasks where there are stereotypes associated with race or ethnicity. Stereotype threat is a real thing. Again, it means that if you believe that females are worse than men, this increased anxiety leads to rumination, taxes working memory, and then performance decreases. Perhaps because of things like motivation and confidence and those sorts of things. Yeah.
It's a hallmark of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, that's right. And it's hard to break out of that. It's really hard to break out of that cycle. Right, ideally we break out of that cycle by getting rid of the stereotypes. That's not going to happen anytime soon, unfortunately, right? The culture is the culture. So it is nice to think about strategies for dealing with this and doing intervention kinds of studies. I haven't done these, but I think it's great if people are doing those to deal with this kind of threat. Okay. I do want to say that this is all about the experience that can lead to these differences, the cultural experiential effects. Some people have asked whether there can also still be a biological explanation for some of these differences related to mental rotation performance. Now, the other data I was showing you where it starts at 6 doesn't seem consistent with a biological explanation, right? Because if it's about things like testosterone which shape your brains prenatally, then the difference should be there from the get-go, right? It shouldn't just be starting at age 6. That said, testosterone may still affect performance in other ways that might be relevant here. So, biological explanation. So again, you can ask about whether testosterone has an impact on mental rotation performance. You can do this by measuring testosterone levels in adults, where there are differences. The other sort of quick and dirty way to do this that people have done is they use the digit ratio on your fingers. Do you know about this? Okay, I hesitate to do this because then I can't get you guys out of like stopping, right? That's okay. So testosterone, again, important for development of sex organs. It also shapes, like I said, the organization of your brain, which is why we think males and females use different kinds of information. It turns out that testosterone is also really important for determining the length of your fingers. Okay? So if you look at your index finger, right here, and you compare it to your ring finger, one is a more male pattern and the other one is a more female pattern. So the longer index finger tends to mean less testosterone prenatally. Tends to, right? This is not a perfect index, okay? Don't sweat it, right? And it, like, who cares about testosterone really? Anyway, so this is the more female pattern. The even pattern, where it's more aligned, or where the index is actually even shorter, is more testosterone prenatally. This is more testosterone natally. This is less. So on average, it's a very rough approximation. Don't sweat it. And like I said, who cares about testosterone, right? But so one thing that people have tried to do is look at whether the digit ratios predict performance on mental rotation. It does weakly, okay? Other people have also looked at, for example, testing males in particular across seasons and throughout the day, because testosterone levels differ across seasons and throughout the day. So you can test a man in the morning versus the evening and see whether it performs differently. There are some correlations, again, they're very weak. So people have actually tried to look at these effects more directly, again, by either measuring testosterone levels or looking at groups of children who differ in terms of their testosterone levels because of a disorder, for example, known as congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH. So kids who have CAH were exposed to more testosterone on average prenatally. This is usually seen more obviously in girls, because what it means generally, you can't tell the difference if you look at someone whether they have CAH or not. But at birth, the indicator is usually that the sex organs are a bit ambiguous, and then children get tested, and you find out that a girl in particular may have CAH, right? Would be the more obvious case where you would have a girl tested. So these are kids with high levels of testosterone exposure prenatally, and like I said, early postnatally up to about 6 months, and then it changes. But what's interesting about these children is that they've measured their performance on mental rotation, and they do show differences in that girls with CAH tend to perform better on mental rotation than girls that don't have CAH. But the other thing that is even stronger in terms of an effect, that is highly reliable, is that they prefer different activities. These girls prefer different activities than girls without CAH, right? They tend to prefer activities that are considered the more boy-type activities, right? The blocks, the cars, and stuff like that. So these are just those data. So these are the control girls. It means they don't have CAH, and these are the CAH girls. They play with boy toys a lot more than the control girls. They play less with the girl toys, and they're comparable with the neutral. So this is also suggesting that at least with mental rotation, one thing that the biological difference may do, and why you don't see the mental rotation difference before age 6, is that it does affect the activities you like. And then those activities certain activities tend to be better for mental rotation, right? So it may not be testosterone affecting mental rotation directly and your ability for mental rotation, but it may affect your preferences and the activities you play with. Which again, if some are better for mental rotation, like block building and video games, then you end up doing better in mental rotation because of the difference in preference. What's also really interesting about this is some people initially when they saw these data were like, maybe it's not that they seek those activities out. Maybe the parents do this, right? Because if the parent knows a girl has CAH, right, maybe they think, oh, I should treat her more like a boy and give her the boy toys more than a girl without CAH. So it turns out it's actually the exact opposite. That in these cases, the parents seem to overcompensate. And they give these girls even more girly-like toys, the dolls and stuff like that. And yet, their own preference is for the other toys and the toys they end up playing more with. Okay. Okay, before we go, I know it's almost time to end today. I just want to say that the next topic we'll be covering is number and number development. And I just want to preview by saying I think this number in some ways is a lot like language. It gives us the capacity to do things that are just so remarkable that other animals don't do, right? Being able to do number, interpret number and do math, right, allows for all the technology we have in the world, really, right? So it's really interesting to think about where those capacities come from. And where those capacities go wrong, right? Because there are people who do things like that, right? And yet, let me show you something before you leave. We do this, and yet, I'm going to show you a monkey. Can you see what this little monkey's doing? Look at, I love this video. See his head bobbing? Does he not look like he's at a casino? like just playing. Give this little monkey like a cigarette and like a shot of whiskey, right? Small number, big number. Small number, big number, right? So we know humans have even adult humans have difficulty calculating a fifth. And yet, there's some evolutionary basis that we all have that is going to make us sensitive to number, at least in its non-symbolic form. So we'll pick up with this kind of ability next time when we meet.
Maybe like the